What if I told you that behind the grandeur of the Oval Office lies a collection of secrets so heavy that even the most powerful leaders in the world carried them to their graves? Today, we're diving deep into the darkest confessions and biggest regrets of every U.S. president. And trust me, some of these will absolutely blow your mind. Picture this. You're the leader of the free world, making decisions that affect millions of lives, and yet you're haunted by choices that keep you awake at night. From George Washington to Joe Biden, every single commander-in-chief has wrestled with moments they wish they could take back. And today, you're about to discover exactly what those moments were. Let's start with our founding father, George Washington, who, despite his legendary status, carried a regret that might surprise you. Washington's biggest regret wasn't about military strategy or political decisions, but rather his role in the institution of slavery. Despite being a slaveholder himself, Washington grew increasingly uncomfortable with the practice throughout his presidency. In his final years, he privately expressed deep regret about not taking a stronger stand against slavery when he had the power to influence the entire nation's direction. He once confided that his greatest fear was that future generations would judge him harshly for perpetuating an institution he knew was morally wrong. John Adams, our second president, harbored a different kind of regret. The man who helped forge American independence spent his final years tormented by the Alien and Sedition Acts, which he signed in 1798. These laws, which restricted free speech and targeted immigrants, became Adams' greatest political nightmare. He later admitted that signing these acts was the biggest mistake of his presidency, acknowledging that they violated the very principles of liberty and free speech that the American Revolution had fought to establish. Adams feared that history would remember him as a hypocrite who championed freedom while simultaneously restricting it. Thomas Jefferson, despite penning the immortal words, "All men are created equal," lived with perhaps the most glaring contradiction of any president. His biggest regret centered on his relationship with Sally Hemings and his inability to reconcile his anti-slavery writings with his personal life as a slaveholder. Jefferson knew that his legacy would be forever tainted by this hypocrisy, and he spent countless sleepless nights grappling with the moral implications of his actions versus his words. James Madison, the father of the Constitution, surprisingly regretted not making the document stronger regarding federal power. After witnessing the War of 1812 and the challenges of governing a young nation, Madison realized that the Constitution he had helped create might have been too restrictive on federal authority. He privately expressed concern that his creation might hinder future presidents from effectively governing during national crises. James Monroe's greatest regret involved the Missouri Compromise of 1820. While this legislation temporarily resolved the slavery crisis, Monroe knew it was merely kicking the can down the road. He confided to close friends that he feared this compromise would eventually tear the nation apart, and he was haunted by the thought that his presidency had simply delayed an inevitable catastrophe rather than solving the fundamental problem. John Quincy Adams carried the burden of what many considered the most controversial presidential election in American history. His regret wasn't winning the presidency in 1824, but rather how he won it. The election was decided by the House of Representatives after no candidate received a majority of electoral votes, and accusations of a corrupt bargain with Henry Clay plagued Adams' entire presidency. He spent 4 years regretting that his presidency began under a cloud of suspicion that he never fully escaped. Andrew Jackson, known for his fiery temperament and decisive actions, had one regret that might shock you. He regretted not hanging his own vice president, John C. Calhoun. Jackson believed Calhoun was a traitor for supporting nullification, the idea that states could nullify federal laws. In his final years, Jackson reportedly said that his biggest regret was not having Calhoun executed for treason, believing that doing so might have prevented the Civil War. Martin Van Buren's presidency was defined by economic crisis, but his deepest regret was more personal. He regretted following too closely in Andrew Jackson's footsteps rather than establishing his own identity as president. Van Buren felt that his loyalty to Jackson's policies, particularly regarding banking, led directly to the economic panic that destroyed his presidency and his historical legacy. William Henry Harrison's regret was tragically brief but profound. During his short time in office before his death, Harrison confided to his doctors that he regretted giving such a long inaugural speech in terrible weather. He knew that his stubbornness in proving his vitality had likely contributed to his illness, and he feared that his death would leave the young nation in constitutional chaos. John Tyler's biggest regret was accepting the Whig Party's nomination for vice president. Tyler knew his states' rights philosophy conflicted with Whig principles, but he hoped to influence the party from within. After becoming president and being expelled from his own party, Tyler regretted not staying true to his Democratic roots from the beginning. James Polk achieved most of his presidential goals but paid a terrible personal price. His greatest regret was sacrificing his health and family relationships for political ambition. Polk worked himself to death, literally, and in his final months, he expressed deep sorrow about missing precious time with his wife Sarah and not taking better care of his physical well-being. Zachary Taylor, the war hero turned president, regretted entering politics at all. Taylor had no political experience and felt overwhelmed by the complex issues facing the nation, particularly the slavery question. He privately told friends that he regretted leaving his military career, where problems had clear solutions, for the murky world of politics, where every decision seemed to create more problems. Millard Fillmore's regret centered on the Compromise of 1850, particularly the Fugitive Slave Act. While he believed the compromise prevented immediate civil war, Fillmore later acknowledged that the Fugitive Slave Act was morally indefensible. He spent his post-presidency years regretting that he had prioritized political expediency over moral clarity. Franklin Pierce carried perhaps the heaviest emotional burden of any president. His regret wasn't primarily political, but deeply personal. Pierce blamed himself for his son's death in a train accident just weeks before his inauguration, believing that God was punishing him for his political ambitions. This tragedy, combined with his failure to prevent the Kansas-Nebraska Act from leading to Bleeding Kansas, left Pierce a broken man who regretted ever seeking the presidency. James Buchanan's regret was monumental in its consequences. As the Civil War approached, Buchanan regretted his complete inaction and indecision. He later admitted that his greatest failure was not taking decisive action to prevent secession, acknowledging that his passive approach had allowed the Union to dissolve on his watch. Buchanan died, knowing that history would judge him as the president who failed to prevent America's greatest catastrophe. Abraham Lincoln, despite his eventual status as perhaps America's greatest president, harbored deep regrets about the human cost of preserving the Union. Lincoln was haunted by every casualty report from the Civil War, often saying that he regretted that so many had to die for his decision to preserve the Union. He questioned whether there might have been another way to end slavery without such devastating loss of life. Andrew Johnson's regret was allowing his personal prejudices to override his presidential duties. Johnson later acknowledged that his lenient Reconstruction policies and opposition to civil rights legislation stemmed from his own racial biases. He regretted not rising above his personal feelings to do what was best for the newly freed slaves and the nation as a whole. Ulysses S. Grant, the Civil War hero, regretted his naivety about politics and his misplaced trust in friends. Grant's presidency was plagued by corruption scandals, not because he was corrupt, but because he trusted the wrong people. He spent his final years regretting that his political inexperience had allowed his administration to become synonymous with corruption, tarnishing his legacy as a war hero. Rutherford Hayes regretted the compromise that made him president. The 1876 election was decided by a backroom deal that ended Reconstruction in exchange for Hayes receiving the presidency. Hayes knew this compromise betrayed newly freed slaves and regretted that his presidency began with such a morally questionable arrangement. James Garfield's regret was brief but poignant. During his short presidency, Garfield expressed regret about the political patronage system that was consuming his administration. He had wanted to focus on civil service reform, but found himself overwhelmed by office seekers. Ironically, his assassination by a disappointed office seeker ultimately led to the civil service reforms he had advocated. Chester Arthur surprised everyone by becoming an effective president, but he regretted his past as a political hack. Arthur's greatest regret was the years he spent as a corrupt political operative in New York before becoming vice president. He spent his presidency trying to atone for his past by championing civil service reform and honest government. Grover Cleveland, who served non-consecutive terms, regretted his response to economic crises during his second presidency. Cleveland's adherence to conservative economic principles during the Panic of 1893 led to widespread suffering. He later regretted not taking more aggressive action to help struggling Americans during the Depression. Benjamin Harrison regretted the high tariffs his administration imposed, which contributed to economic problems and his electoral defeat. Harrison acknowledged that his protectionist policies, while intended to help American businesses, had hurt consumers and damaged international trade relationships. William McKinley's regret was not seeing the Spanish-American War coming sooner and not better preparing for America's new role as a global power. McKinley realized that his reluctance to embrace American imperialism had left the nation unprepared for its new international responsibilities. Theodore Roosevelt's regret might surprise you, given his reputation for bold action. Roosevelt regretted his promise not to run for a third term after completing McKinley's presidency and winning election in his own right. He later tried to return to politics, but regretted limiting himself with that promise, believing he could have accomplished much more with additional time in office. William Taft regretted accepting the presidency at all. Taft never wanted to be president. He wanted to be a Supreme Court justice. His greatest regret was allowing others to convince him to run for president instead of pursuing his true passion for the law from the beginning. Woodrow Wilson carried multiple regrets, but his greatest was his rigid approach to creating the League of Nations. Wilson regretted not compromising with the Senate, which might have allowed the United States to join his beloved international organization. His all-or-nothing approach left America isolated from the very institution he had created to ensure world peace. Warren Harding knew he was in over his head and regretted surrounding himself with corrupt friends. Harding's candid admission that he was not fit for the presidency reflected his deep regret about accepting a job he knew he couldn't handle effectively. Calvin Coolidge regretted his inactive approach to the growing economic speculation of the 1920s. While he was president during the Roaring Twenties, Coolidge later expressed concern that his hands-off approach to financial regulation might have contributed to the conditions that led to the Great Depression. Herbert Hoover regretted his rigid adherence to limited government philosophy during the early years of the Great Depression. Hoover later acknowledged that his reluctance to use federal power to address the economic crisis had prolonged American suffering and destroyed his presidency. Franklin Roosevelt's regret was deeply personal and political. FDR regretted his decision to intern Japanese Americans during World War II, later acknowledging it as one of the greatest mistakes of his presidency. He also regretted not doing more to help Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi persecution. Harry Truman regretted the necessity of using atomic weapons against Japan, while he believed the decision saved lives by ending World War II. Quickly, Truman was haunted by the massive civilian casualties and spent the rest of his life questioning whether there might have been another way. Dwight Eisenhower regretted not doing more to advance civil rights during his presidency. Despite his behind-the-scenes efforts, Eisenhower later acknowledged that he should have provided stronger public leadership on racial equality during the crucial early years of the civil rights movement. John Kennedy regretted the Bay of Pigs invasion, calling it the worst mistake of his presidency. The failed attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro taught Kennedy valuable lessons about trusting military and intelligence advisors, but he deeply regretted the loss of life and international embarrassment it caused. Lyndon Johnson's regret was monumental: the Vietnam War. Despite his incredible domestic achievements with the Great Society programs, Johnson was tormented by the escalating conflict in Southeast Asia. He regretted not finding a way to end American involvement earlier and often said the war had destroyed his presidency. Richard Nixon's regrets were numerous, but his greatest was allowing the Watergate cover-up to continue. Nixon later acknowledged that his biggest mistake wasn't the initial break-in, which he didn't order, but his decision to obstruct justice in the aftermath. He regretted that his paranoia and poor judgment cost him the presidency. Gerald Ford regretted his pardon of Richard Nixon, even though he believed it was necessary for the country to heal. Ford knew the decision would cost him the 1976 election, but he regretted that many Americans never understood his motivation for putting the nation's needs above his political survival. Jimmy Carter regretted his inability to secure the release of American hostages in Iran sooner. The 444-day hostage crisis defined Carter's presidency, and he spent the rest of his life regretting that he couldn't bring those Americans home faster. Ronald Reagan regretted the Iran-Contra affair, particularly his administration's secret arms sales to Iran. Reagan insisted he wasn't fully aware of the details, but he regretted that this scandal tarnished his second term and violated his own stated policies. George H.W. Bush regretted breaking his "no new taxes" pledge during the 1990 budget negotiations. While he believed the compromise was necessary for fiscal responsibility, Bush regretted that this decision cost him conservative support and contributed to his 1992 defeat. Bill Clinton regretted his affair with Monica Lewinsky and the subsequent impeachment crisis. Clinton acknowledged that his personal misconduct damaged the presidency and his family, overshadowing many of his policy achievements. George W. Bush regretted the intelligence failures that led to the Iraq War. While Bush maintained that removing Saddam Hussein was the right decision, he regretted that the weapons of mass destruction intelligence was wrong, making the war much more controversial than it needed to be. Barack Obama regretted not doing more to bridge partisan divides during his presidency. Despite his campaign promises to unite the country, Obama acknowledged that political polarization actually increased during his time in office, something he deeply regretted. Donald Trump regretted his response to the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly in its early stages. Though he rarely admits mistakes publicly, Trump privately expressed regret about not taking the threat seriously sooner, knowing it contributed to his 2020 election loss. Joe Biden's presidency is still unfolding, but he has already expressed regret about the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan. Biden acknowledged that the evacuation could have been handled better, even while defending the decision to end America's longest war. What makes these regrets so fascinating is how they reveal the human side of the presidency. These weren't just political leaders making calculated decisions. They were human beings wrestling with impossible choices, often in situations where every option carried terrible consequences. Some regrets were about missed opportunities to do the right thing, like Washington and slavery or Eisenhower and civil rights. Others were about good intentions that led to unintended consequences, like Wilson's rigid idealism or Johnson's escalation in Vietnam. The most tragic regrets were personal ones that affected presidential performance, like Pierce's grief over his son's death or Franklin Roosevelt's declining health during crucial World War II negotiations. What's remarkable is how many presidents' biggest regrets weren't about their failures, but about their successes that came at too high a cost. Lincoln saved the Union but regretted the massive loss of life. Truman ended World War II but regretted using atomic weapons. These men understood that even necessary decisions could leave deep moral scars. Looking at these regrets also reveals how the presidency has evolved. Early presidents regretted personal moral compromises, particularly around slavery. Mid-20th century presidents regretted military decisions and their human costs. Modern presidents increasingly regret their inability to unite the country and bridge political divisions. Perhaps most importantly, these regrets show that the best presidents were those who learned from their mistakes and were haunted by their moral compromises. The presidents we remember most favorably are often those who carried the heaviest burdens of regret, suggesting that moral awareness and self-reflection are crucial presidential qualities. The presidency remains the world's most powerful and lonely job, where every decision affects millions of lives and where the weight of history hangs on every choice. Understanding these regrets doesn't diminish these leaders. It humanizes them and reminds us that even the most powerful people in history were ultimately human beings, trying to do their best in impossible circumstances. These regrets will continue to shape how we understand American history and the presidency itself. They remind us that leadership isn't about perfection. It's about learning from mistakes, carrying the weight of difficult decisions, and ultimately trying to leave the world better than you found it, even when you fall short of your own ideals.